The gunshot that rang out across the dusty main street of Hays City, Kansas, wasn't meant to kill anyone, but it sure got everyone's attention when Penelope Morgan fired her father's revolver straight into the air during Sunday service in 1878. The congregation had been singing hymns inside the whitewashed church when the preacher's daughter decided she'd had enough of being told how a proper young lady should behave, and the echo of that shot would change her life forever. Penelope stood in the churchyard afterward, her dark auburn hair falling loose from the pins that were supposed to keep it properly arranged, her green eyes blazing with defiance as her father, Reverend Thomas Morgan, stared at her with a mixture of horror and disappointment. The good people of Hays City gathered at a safe distance, whispering among themselves about how the girl had always been trouble, how she rode horses too fast, laughed too loud, and spoke her mind when she should have kept silent like a decent Christian woman. "Penelope Grace Morgan, what in the name of the Lord has gotten into you?" her father demanded, his weathered face flushed red beneath his graying beard. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from his younger days working ranches before he found his calling, but right now he looked older than his 50 years. "Nothing has gotten into me, Father," Penelope said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She was 22 years old and tired of being treated like a child who needed constant correction. "I'm just tired of pretending to be something I'm not. I'm tired of Mrs. Henderson saying I need to be more demure. I'm tired of Mr. Patterson suggesting I need a husband to settle me down. I'm tired of everyone in this town acting like there's something wrong with me, because I don't want to sit quietly and embroider pillowcases for the rest of my life." A cowboy leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon across the street watched the scene with interest, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the young woman who had just disrupted the most important day of the week in this small Kansas town. Harrison Wade was 30 years old, lean and weathered from years of driving cattle up from Texas, and he'd seen plenty of wild things in his time on the frontier. But there was something about the preacher's daughter that caught his attention in a way that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with recognition. Reverend Morgan took a deep breath, clearly trying to control his temper in front of his flock. "Go home, Penelope. We'll discuss this in private." "There's nothing to discuss," Penelope said, but she handed him the revolver and walked toward the small house behind the church where she'd lived her entire life. The crowd parted for her like she carried something contagious, and she could hear their whispers following her every step. Harrison pushed off from the hitching post and crossed the street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He'd only been in Hays City for 3 days, taking a break from the trail before heading back down to Texas for another drive, but something told him his plans were about to change. He approached the Reverend, who was still standing in the churchyard looking lost. "Reverend Morgan," Harrison said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I don't believe we've met. Harrison Wade. I'm a trail boss working out of Fort Worth." The Reverend turned to him with weary eyes. "Mr. Wade, I apologize for the disturbance. My daughter has been going through a difficult time." "Didn't look difficult to me," Harrison said mildly. "Looked like a young woman who knows her own mind. That's not a common thing, and it's not a bad thing, though I suspect folks around here might disagree." Reverend Morgan studied him for a long moment. "You're new to town, so you don't understand. Penelope has always been headstrong, but lately she's become impossible. She refuses to attend the ladies' auxiliary meetings. She sneaks out to ride at night. She's been seen talking to men without a chaperone. The congregation is losing patience with her, and I fear for her reputation." Harrison had heard this kind of talk before, usually from people who confused spirit with rebellion and independence with impropriety. Maybe the problem isn't your daughter, Reverend. Maybe it's the cage everyone's trying to keep her in. The older man's eyes narrowed. That's easy for you to say, Mr. Wade. You're a man. You can do as you please and nobody questions it. But a woman, especially a preacher's daughter, has certain expectations to uphold. And if she can't uphold them, then she'll find herself alone and outcast, and that's a hard life for anyone, but especially for a woman on the frontier. There was genuine fear in the Reverend's voice now, and Harrison realized the man wasn't just worried about his reputation. He was worried about his daughter's future. Harrison nodded slowly. I understand your concern, sir, but maybe what she needs isn't more people telling her what she can't do. Maybe she needs someone who appreciates what she can do. He tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving the Reverend standing alone in the churchyard. Harrison didn't head back to the saloon, though. Instead, he found himself walking toward the small corral behind the general store where he'd been boarding his horse. Something told him he'd be seeing the preacher's daughter again soon, and when he did, he wanted to be ready. Penelope sat in her small bedroom, staring out the window at the endless Kansas prairie that stretched beyond the town. The room was neat and spare, with a simple bed, a dresser, and a small desk where she sometimes wrote letters to her aunt in St. Louis. Her mother had died when Penelope was 12, succumbing to fever after a hard winter, and since then it had been just her and her father. He'd done his best to raise her properly, but there had always been something in Penelope that resisted proper raising. She'd been the girl who climbed trees instead of playing with dolls, who asked why women couldn't be doctors or lawyers when her father read the newspaper aloud, who once rode her horse 15 miles to see the railroad crews laying track because she wanted to watch the engines up close. Her father had been horrified when the sheriff brought her back, but Penelope had been exhilarated. Now she was 22, and everyone in town expected her to be married by now, settled down with children and a house to keep. But Penelope couldn't imagine spending the rest of her life washing someone else's clothes and cooking someone else's meals and biting her tongue every time she had an opinion about something. She wanted more than that, even if she couldn't quite articulate what more meant. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Penelope, may I come in?" Her father's voice was gentle now, the anger from earlier having faded into resignation. "Yes, Father." Reverend Morgan entered and sat on the edge of her bed, his big hands clasped between his knees. He looked tired and sad, and Penelope felt a pang of guilt for causing him so much trouble. She knew he loved her, even if he didn't understand her. "I'm sorry about today," she said before he could speak. "I shouldn't have fired the gun. I scared people, and that wasn't right." "No, it wasn't," he agreed. "But I think we need to talk about what's really troubling you. This isn't just about today, is it?" Penelope shook her head. "I feel like I'm suffocating here, Father. Everyone expects me to be someone I'm not, and every day it gets harder to pretend. I love you and I respect your work, but I can't be the perfect preacher's daughter that everyone wants. I just can't." Her father was silent for a long moment. "Your mother was like you, you know, spirited and strong-willed. When I met her, she was breaking horses on her father's ranch, wearing trousers and cursing like a cowhand. Her family despaired of her ever finding a husband." Penelope stared at him in surprise. She'd never heard this about her mother, who had always been presented to her as a model of feminine virtue and propriety. "What happened?" she asked. "I fell in love with her," her father said simply. "Not despite her wildness, but because of it. She was alive in a way that most people aren't, and being around her made me feel alive too. After we married, she tried to be what people expected of a preacher's wife, and she was good at it. But I always wondered if I'd asked too much of her, if trying to fit into that mold had dimmed some of her light." Tears stung Penelope's eyes. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" "Because I was afraid you'd think it was permission to be reckless, and the world is hard on reckless women." He reached out and took her hand. "But today, I realized that trying to force you to be something you're not is just as dangerous. I don't want you to lose yourself the way I sometimes feared your mother did. I want you to be happy, even if that happiness looks different from what I imagined for you." Penelope threw her arms around her father's neck, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "But," he said, pulling back to look at her seriously, "you need to be smart about this. The world isn't kind to women who don't follow the rules, and I won't always be here to protect you. Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Penelope said, and she meant it. Over the next few days, word spread through Hayes City about the preacher's daughter and her scandalous behavior. Some people were sympathetic, remembering their own youthful rebellions, but most were convinced that Penelope Morgan was headed for trouble and would probably drag respectable people down with her. The ladies' auxiliary held an emergency meeting to discuss whether she should be banned from church functions, and several mothers forbade their daughters from associating with her. Penelope tried not to care about the gossip, but it was hard to walk down the street and feel people's eyes on her, hard to hear conversations stop when she entered the general store. She spent more time alone, taking long rides on her mare, Juniper, out onto the prairie where nobody could judge her. It was on one of these rides that she encountered Harrison Wade again. She'd ridden about 5 miles out of town, following a creek that wound through the grassland, when she saw smoke rising from a small hollow. Curious and a little wary, she guided Juniper toward it and found a camp with a single bedroll, a small fire, and a rangy bay horse grazing nearby. A man stood with his back to her, pouring coffee from a battered pot into a tin cup. "Afternoon," she called out, not wanting to startle him. Harrison turned and smiled when he saw her. "Afternoon, Miss Morgan. You're a long way from town." Penelope dismounted, leading Juniper by the reins. "I could say the same about you. Most cowboys stay close to the saloons and card games when they are in town." "I prefer my own company most of the time," Harrison said. He gestured to the fire. "I've got coffee if you want some. It's not fancy, but it's hot." She knew she shouldn't. A proper young lady definitely shouldn't be alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere. But Penelope was tired of being proper, and there was something about Harrison Wade that made her feel like she didn't have to pretend with him. "I'd like that," she said, tying Juniper to a scrubby tree near his horse. Harrison poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire. Up close, Penelope could see that he was handsome in a rough way, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black, and they watched her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. "I saw what happened at the church last Sunday," Harrison said after a moment. "That took courage." Penelope laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everyone else says it was reckless and shameful. Everyone else is probably too scared to do what they really want to do, so they get angry at people who aren't scared." He sipped his coffee. "I've been working cattle drives since I was 16. Seen a lot of the country, met a lot of people. And the ones I remember, the ones who made an impression, they're all people who refuse to be boxed in by what others thought they should be." "Is that why you live out here instead of in town?" Penelope asked. "Part of it. Mostly I just like the quiet. And the stars are better out here than anywhere else." He looked at her thoughtfully. "What is it you want, Miss Morgan? If you could do anything, be anything, what would it be?" It was a question nobody had ever asked her before, and Penelope found herself considering it seriously. "I want to feel free," she said finally. I want to ride as fast as I want and go where I want and say what I think without everyone acting like I've committed a crime. I want to matter for something more than how well I can pour tea or how quietly I can sit in church. I want to feel alive." Harrison nodded as if that made perfect sense to him. "Then you should do those things." "It's not that simple. I'm a woman. I'm a preacher's daughter. There are expectations." "Expectations are just other people's fears dressed up as rules," Harrison said. "You want my advice? Stop living for other people and start living for yourself. You'll be happier, and the people who really care about you will adjust." They talked for over an hour, sitting by that small fire in the middle of the prairie. Harrison told her about his life on the cattle trails, the dangers and adventures of driving herds from Texas to the railheads in Kansas. He told her about thunderstorms that could spook 1,000 head of cattle into a stampede, about crossing rivers swollen with spring runoff, about nights so cold you could see your breath even in your bedroll. Penelope told him about growing up in Hays City, about losing her mother, about the frustration of always being told she was too much or not enough. She told him things she'd never told anyone, and he listened without judgment or advice, just letting her words flow. When the sun started dropping toward the horizon, Penelope knew she needed to get back before her father worried. She stood reluctantly, brushing prairie grass from her skirt. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, "and for listening." Harrison stood too. "Anytime. I'll probably be out here for a few more days before I head back to Texas. You're welcome to visit if you want company." Penelope smiled. "I might take you up on that." She rode back to town as the sky turned pink and gold, feeling lighter than she had in months. There was something about Harrison Wade that made her feel seen in a way nobody else ever had, and she found herself thinking about him long after she'd unsaddled Juniper and gone inside for supper. Over the next week, Penelope visited Harrison's camp 3 more times. She told herself it was just because she enjoyed having someone to talk to who didn't judge her, but deep down she knew it was more than that. She was drawn to him in a way that had nothing to do with friendship, and everything to do with the way her heart beat faster when she saw him, the way she caught herself thinking about him at random moments during the day. Harrison seemed to feel it too, though neither of them spoke about it directly. He started staying closer to town instead of heading back to Texas, taking odd jobs at the local ranches and finding excuses to be where she might see him. They were careful to maintain propriety when others were around, but when they were alone on the prairie, the air between them crackled with unspoken feelings. It was on her 4th visit to his camp that things changed. Penelope arrived in the late afternoon to find Harrison working with his horse, checking the bay's hooves for stones. He looked up when he heard her approach and smiled, that slow, easy smile that made her stomach flip. "Starting to think you weren't coming today," he said. "I had to help Father with some church business this morning," Penelope said, dismounting. "Mrs. Henderson wanted to discuss the upcoming Harvest Festival, and you know how she can talk." Harrison laughed. "I've met Mrs. Henderson. That woman could talk the ears off a mule." They fell into their usual comfortable conversation, but today, there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Penelope found herself acutely aware of every movement Harrison made, every time his eyes lingered on her face. When he handed her a cup of coffee and their fingers brushed, she felt the contact like an electric shock. "Penelope," Harrison said suddenly, setting down his own cup, "I need to tell you something." Her heart was pounding. "What is it?" "I've been offered a job managing a ranch down in the Texas Panhandle. It's good money and it's the kind of work I've been hoping to do instead of just driving cattle. But it means leaving Kansas, and I find myself not wanting to leave." "Why not?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Harrison moved around the fire to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. Because of you. Because every day I spend around you, I realize you're exactly what I've been looking for my whole life without knowing it. You're brave and honest and full of life, and being near you makes me want to be better than I am. Penelope's breath caught. Harrison, I know this is fast, he interrupted. I know we've only known each other for a couple of weeks. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I think you might feel it too. I do, Penelope admitted. I think I started falling for you the first day we talked. You make me feel like I'm not crazy for wanting more than what this town has to offer. Harrison reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. You're not crazy. You're perfect exactly as you are. You're wild and free and beautiful, and I don't want you to change a single thing about yourself. Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes. Everyone else in town thinks I'm too wild. They think I need to be tamed or settled or fixed somehow. Then everyone else is a fool, Harrison said fiercely. You don't need to be tamed. You need to be with someone who appreciates your wildness, who wants to run wild right alongside you. He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. You're wild enough for me, Penelope Morgan, more than enough. You're everything. She kissed him then, closing the distance between them and pressing her lips to his. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she'd imagined and more. Harrison kissed her back gently at first, then with more passion as she leaned into him. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and Penelope felt like she'd found something she didn't even know she'd been searching for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. Come with me, he said. Come to Texas. We'll get married and run that ranch together, and you can be as wild as you want to be. Penelope's mind was spinning. Harrison, I can't just leave. Your father wants you to be happy. He told me so himself the day we met. Harrison pulled back to look at her seriously. I'm not asking you to run away, Penelope. I'm asking you to marry me properly, with your father's blessing if we can get it. I'm asking you to build a life with me, a life where you don't have to apologize for who you are. Yes, Penelope said without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll go to Texas with you. I'll go anywhere with you. They kissed again, longer and deeper this time, and Penelope felt like her heart might burst from the joy of it. She'd spent so long feeling trapped and misunderstood, and now here was this man who not only understood her but loved her for exactly who she was. But convincing her father would be another matter entirely. That evening, Penelope returned home to find Reverend Morgan reading his Bible at the kitchen table. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have given her away because he immediately set the book aside. What's happened? He asked. Penelope took a deep breath. Father, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really listen before you react. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, folding her hands on the table in front of her. I've been spending time with Harrison Wade, she began. The cowboy who spoke to you after the incident at church. We've been meeting out on the prairie, and I know that's improper, but I need you to understand that nothing inappropriate has happened. We've just been talking, getting to know each other. Her father's expression was unreadable. Go on. He's asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. He has a job offer managing a ranch in Texas, and he wants me to go with him. I want to go, Father. I want to marry him and start a new life somewhere I don't have to constantly worry about living up to everyone's expectations. The silence that followed felt endless. Reverend Morgan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. Finally, he spoke. You love him? Yes, Penelope said without hesitation. I know it's only been a short time, but yes, I love him, and he loves me, Father. He loves me for who I am, not who he thinks I should be. And you trust him? You believe he'll treat you well, provide for you, respect you. I do. He's a good man, Father. He's honest and hardworking, and he sees me, really sees me. Her father turned back to face her, and she was surprised to see tears in his eyes. I told you about your mother, about how wild she was when I met her. What I didn't tell you is that marrying her and bringing her into this life was both the best and the worst thing I ever did. Best because I loved her more than life itself. Worst because I watched her spirit dim year by year as she tried to be what this town needed her to be. Father, he held up a hand. Let me finish. When she died, I promised myself I wouldn't make the same mistake with you. I tried to give you room to be yourself while still protecting you from the harsh judgments of others. But I've been failing at that, haven't I? I've been so worried about what the congregation thinks that I've been putting their expectations above your happiness. You've done your best, Penelope said softly. This isn't your fault. Maybe not, but I can make it right now. He came back to the table and took her hands. If you truly love this man, if you truly believe he'll make you happy and treat you well, then you have my blessing to marry him. I'll miss you terribly, but I'd rather miss you and know you're happy than have you stay here and wither away like a flower in the wrong soil. Penelope stood and hugged her father tightly, crying into his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for understanding. I do have one condition, he said, pulling back. I want to meet with this Harrison Wade properly. If he's going to marry my daughter, I need to look him in the eye and make sure he understands what a precious gift he's being given. He knows, Penelope said, smiling through her tears. But I'll bring him to meet you tomorrow. The next morning, Harrison rode into town and presented himself at the preacher's house, his best shirt cleaned and his hair freshly cut. Penelope answered the door and led him into the small parlor where her father waited. The two men studied each other for a long moment. Harrison was the first to speak. Reverend Morgan, I want to marry your daughter. I know we haven't known each other long, and I know I'm not the kind of man you probably imagined for her. I'm a cowboy with calloused hands and no family to speak of. But I love Penelope with everything I am, and I swear to you that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she never regrets choosing me. Reverend Morgan nodded slowly. Sit down, Mr. Wade. Let's talk. They talked for over 2 hours. The Reverend asked Harrison about his past, his plans for the future, his faith, his character. He asked hard questions about how Harrison would provide for Penelope, what would happen if times got hard, whether he understood the responsibilities of marriage. Harrison answered every question honestly and directly, never trying to embellish or hide anything. Finally, the Reverend sat back in his chair. My daughter told me something yesterday that I think is important for you to hear. She said you love her for who she is, not who you think she should be. Is that true? Yes, sir, Harrison said. Penelope is the most remarkable woman I've ever met. She's brave and passionate and full of life, and I don't want to change a single thing about her. The world has enough quiet, obedient women. What it needs is more women like your daughter who aren't afraid to be exactly who they are. A smile tugged at the corner of Reverend Morgan's mouth. You remind me of myself 30 years ago, Mr. Wade. I said almost the exact same thing about my wife to her father. He stood and extended his hand. You have my blessing. Take care of my girl. Harrison shook his hand firmly. I will, sir. I promise you that. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church where Penelope had caused such a scandal. The congregation was divided in their attendance. Some people stayed away, convinced that the preacher's wild daughter was making a terrible mistake. But others came, curious to see the union and perhaps secretly hoping that love could triumph over convention. Penelope wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried wildflowers that Harrison had picked for her that morning. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes locked on Harrison's face, and she felt more certain of this decision than she'd ever felt about anything in her life. Harrison stood at the altar in a new suit, his dark eyes shining with emotion as he watched her approach. When her father placed her hand in Harrison's and stepped back, Penelope felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. Reverend Morgan performed the ceremony himself, his voice strong and steady as he spoke about love and commitment and partnership. When he got to the vows, both Harrison and Penelope spoke clearly and firmly, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said, his voice catching slightly. "You may kiss your bride." Harrison cupped Penelope's face in his hands and kissed her gently, and the small crowd erupted in applause. They walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, Penelope's face glowing with happiness. The reception was modest, held in the churchyard with food provided by the women of the congregation who had forgiven, or at least accepted Penelope's wildness. Mrs. Henderson even made a cake, though she couldn't resist telling Penelope that she hoped marriage would settle her down. Penelope just smiled and thanked her for the cake. As the sun began to set, Harrison and Penelope said their goodbyes. They would leave for Texas the next morning, starting their new life together. Penelope hugged her father one last time, both of them crying. "Be happy," he whispered to her. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." "I will be," she promised. "I already am." The journey to Texas took 3 weeks, and every day of it was an adventure. They traveled with a small wagon carrying Penelope's belongings and supplies for their new life, taking their time and camping under the stars each night. Harrison taught Penelope how to cook over an open fire, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to navigate by the stars. She proved to be a quick learner and an enthusiastic partner in every aspect of the journey. At night, lying in Harrison's arms in their shared bedroll, Penelope felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. This was what she'd been searching for, this sense of freedom and partnership and belonging. She wasn't being asked to diminish herself or hide her nature. She was being celebrated for exactly who she was. They talked for hours in the darkness, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. Harrison told her about the ranch they were going to, a spread of 5,000 acres in the Panhandle where they'd be raising cattle and horses. The owner was an older man named Samuel Carter, who was looking for someone younger to manage the day-to-day operations while he gradually retired. "He knows you're coming with me," Harrison said. "I told him I was bringing my wife, and he said you're welcome to be as involved in the ranch work as you want to be." His own wife worked cattle alongside him for 40 years before she passed, so he doesn't have any silly notions about what women can and can't do. Penelope kissed him. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Harrison said. "Every wild, wonderful part of you." They reached the ranch in late September, when the Texas Panhandle was still sweltering but starting to show hints of the coming autumn. The land was different from Kansas, more rugged and dry, with mesas rising in the distance and vast stretches of grassland perfect for grazing. The ranch house was a sturdy adobe structure with a wide porch and thick walls to keep out the summer heat. Samuel Carter came out to greet them, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "You must be Mrs. Wade," he said to Penelope. "Harrison told me he was bringing a special woman, and I can see he wasn't exaggerating," Penelope laughed. "I hope he didn't oversell me too much." "Not at all. Come on in and I'll show you around." The ranch was everything Harrison had promised and more. There were 300 head of cattle, 24 horses, and endless work to be done. Samuel had 3 other hands who worked the ranch, all experienced cowboys who welcomed Harrison and were respectful if slightly puzzled by Penelope's immediate involvement in the work. She proved herself quickly. Growing up in Kansas, she'd learned to ride well, and she took to cattle work with natural skill. Harrison taught her how to rope and brand, how to spot sick animals and treat common ailments, how to manage the herd during roundups. The other ranch hands soon learned that Mrs. Wade wasn't some delicate city woman but a capable partner who could hold her own. The first few months were exhausting but exhilarating. Penelope and Harrison worked from dawn to dusk, learning the land and the animals, proving themselves to Samuel and the other hands. At night, they collapsed into bed in the small foreman's house that came with Harrison's position, too tired to do more than hold each other and fall asleep. But as winter approached and the work slowed slightly, they had more time to truly settle into married life. Penelope discovered that she loved running a household when she could do it her own way, without constant criticism and judgment. She cooked hearty meals for the ranch hands, mended clothes, kept the house clean, but she also worked cattle, broke horses, and rode out with Harrison to check the far pastures. One evening in December, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky red and gold. Penelope leaned against Harrison's shoulder, content and peaceful. "Are you happy?" Harrison asked, stroking her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Penelope said. "Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I'd stayed in Hays City, trying to be what everyone wanted me to be, and I can't even imagine it anymore. This is who I'm meant to be, and you're who I'm meant to be with." Harrison kissed the top of her head. "I feel the same way. You know, when I first saw you fire that gun in the churchyard, I thought you were the most alive person I'd ever seen. And every day since then, you've proven me right. You're extraordinary, Penelope." "We're extraordinary together," she corrected him. "You give me the freedom to be myself, and I'd like to think I do the same for you." "You do," Harrison assured her. "Before I met you, I was just drifting. Working cattle drives, making money, but not really building anything. Now I feel like I have a purpose, a future. We're building something together, and that means everything to me." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, and Penelope thought about how far she'd come from that angry young woman firing a gun in a Kansas churchyard. She'd been searching for freedom and found so much more. She'd found love and partnership and a place where she truly belonged. The winter passed peacefully, with occasional snow and cold winds, but nothing too severe. Spring brought new calves and the busy work of branding and vaccinating. Penelope was in the thick of it all, working alongside Harrison and the other hands. Samuel watched them with approval, often commenting to visitors that he'd never seen a better team than Harrison and Penelope Wade. It was in early May that Penelope realized something had changed. She'd been feeling tired and slightly queasy in the mornings, and her monthly courses hadn't come. She waited another week to be sure, then told Harrison one evening as they were getting ready for bed. "I think I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Harrison froze in the act of pulling off his boots. "You think or you know, I'm pretty sure. All the signs are there." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, laughing with joy. "That's wonderful. That's incredible. Are you happy about it?" "I am," Penelope said, and she realized it was true. A year ago, the thought of having a baby would have felt like a trap, another way society tried to force women into acceptable roles. But now, with Harrison, in this life they'd built together, it felt like a natural extension of their love. "I'm really happy about it." They told Samuel the next day, and the old rancher was delighted. "A baby. That's just what this ranch needs. Some young energy to keep us all feeling spry." As Penelope's pregnancy progressed, Harrison became increasingly protective, wanting her to do less work around the ranch. but Penelope refused to be treated like she was fragile. She continued working cattle through her 4th month, finally agreeing to switch to lighter duties only when her balance started to shift, and Harrison pointed out that getting thrown from a horse wouldn't be good for the baby. She spent the next months helping Samuel with the ranch accounts, managing supplies, and preparing their little house for the baby. Harrison built a beautiful cradle from mesquite wood, sanding it smooth and rubbing it with oil until it gleamed. Penelope sewed tiny clothes and blankets, sometimes laughing at herself for doing the kind of domestic work she'd once scorned. But it was different when she chose it, when it was part of a life she'd actively created rather than one imposed on her. In late November, during a cold spell that blew down from the north, Penelope went into labor. Harrison was panicked, but Penelope remained calm. They'd arranged for the wife of one of the ranch hands, a woman named Maria who had 6 children of her own, to serve as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Harrison paced outside the bedroom, listening to Penelope's cries and feeling helpless. Samuel sat with him, offering quiet reassurance and occasionally telling him stories about when his own children were born. Finally, as the sun was setting on the 2nd day, a baby's cry rang out. Maria opened the door with a tired but happy smile. "You have a son, Mr. Wade, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is fine, just exhausted." Harrison rushed into the room to find Penelope propped up against the pillows, sweaty and pale but smiling as she held a red-faced, squalling infant. He knelt beside the bed and looked at his son in wonder. "He's perfect," Harrison whispered. "He has your nose," Penelope said, laughing weakly. "And my temper, from the sound of things." They named him Jacob Thomas Wade, Jacob for Harrison's father who had died when Harrison was young, and Thomas for Penelope's father. They sent a letter to Reverend Morgan telling him about his grandson, and he wrote back with joy and congratulations, saying he hoped to visit in the spring to meet the baby. The first months of parenthood were exhausting but wonderful. Penelope took to motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else, fiercely devoted to her son while still maintaining her independence. As soon as she was able, she was back to working around the ranch, often with Jacob strapped to her back in a carrier that Maria had shown her how to make. Harrison was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son. He sang to Jacob, told him stories about the ranch, and promised him that he'd teach him to ride as soon as he was old enough. Watching Harrison with their son made Penelope fall even more deeply in love with her husband. True to his word, Reverend Morgan made the long journey to Texas in the spring. He arrived looking older and more tired than Penelope remembered, but his face lit up when he saw his daughter and met his grandson for the first time. "He's beautiful," the Reverend said, holding Jacob carefully. "He looks like your mother, Penelope. Same eyes." They spent a wonderful 2 weeks together, with Reverend Morgan gradually relaxing into the rhythm of ranch life. He seemed surprised but pleased to see how happy Penelope was, how completely she'd found her place in this wild Texas landscape. One evening, sitting on the porch while Penelope nursed Jacob inside, Harrison and the Reverend talked. "I want to thank you," Reverend Morgan said, "for keeping your promise to take care of my daughter. I can see that she's truly happy here." "She makes me happy too," Harrison said. "I can't imagine my life without her now. When I first gave you my blessing, I'll admit I had doubts. It all happened so fast, and Penelope had always been impulsive. But seeing you two together, seeing the life you've built, I know I made the right decision." He paused, looking out at the darkening prairie. "I'm not well, Harrison. The doctor in Hays City says my heart is weak. I might have a few years left, or it might be much sooner." Harrison felt a chill of fear. "Does Penelope know?" "Not yet. I'll tell her before I leave." But I wanted you to know first, so you can help her through it when the time comes. She acts strong, but losing me will hurt her deeply. She's already lost her mother. I'll take care of her, Harrison promised. And we'll make sure Jacob knows about his grandfather, knows about the man who gave his mother the freedom to be herself. Reverend Morgan smiled. That's all I can ask for. He told Penelope the next day, and as he'd predicted, she was devastated. But Harrison held her while she cried and reminded her that her father was still alive, still here, and they should make the most of the time they had. They spent the Reverend's remaining week making memories. Penelope showed her father every corner of the ranch, introduced him to all the animals, let him hold Jacob for hours. Harrison took a photograph of the 3 generations together, a precious image that Penelope would treasure always. When it was time for Reverend Morgan to leave, the goodbye was tearful but not hopeless. They promised to write regularly, and the Reverend promised to try to visit again if his health allowed. As he rode away in the hired wagon that would take him to the nearest train station, Penelope stood with Harrison's arm around her, Jacob in her arms, and felt the bittersweet mix of sadness and gratitude. "I'm glad he got to see this," she said quietly. "Glad he got to know that his blessing gave me the happiest life I could imagine." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work and love. Jacob grew into a sturdy, curious boy who was indeed as wild as his mother had been, always exploring and asking questions and pushing boundaries. When he was 3, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. She gave birth to twin girls, Emily and Grace, who had their father's dark eyes and their mother's auburn hair. Samuel Carter gradually turned over more and more of the ranch operations to Harrison and Penelope, officially making Harrison a partner when Jacob was 5. The old man said he couldn't imagine better people to eventually take over the ranch he'd spent his life building. Penelope's father passed away quietly in his sleep 2 years later, and though Penelope grieved deeply, she was comforted by the knowledge that he'd seen her happy and had approved of the life she'd chosen. Harrison held her through the dark days of grief, just as she'd held him when Samuel Carter died of a stroke the following spring. They inherited the ranch as Samuel had arranged, and Harrison and Penelope threw themselves into making it thrive. They expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and built a reputation for quality cattle and horses. Penelope proved to have a head for business, managing the finances and negotiating deals with buyers who learned quickly not to underestimate her because she was a woman. Jacob grew up working the ranch alongside his parents, learning to rope and ride and handle cattle. The twins were equally wild, insisting on doing everything their brother did despite society's expectations for girls. Harrison and Penelope raised them with the same freedom they'd fought so hard to claim for themselves, teaching them that they could be anything they wanted to be. When Jacob was 12, he asked his parents how they'd met. They sat on the porch that evening, the same porch where they'd spent countless nights talking and dreaming, and told their children the whole story. "Your mother was called too wild," Harrison said, smiling at Penelope. "Everyone in her town thought there was something wrong with her because she didn't want to be quiet and obedient. They thought she needed to be tamed or fixed. But your father said something different," Penelope continued, taking Harrison's hand. "He said I was wild enough for him. He didn't want to change me or tame me. He wanted to be wild with me." Emily, always the romantic, sighed happily. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Grace, more practical, frowned thoughtfully. "Were you scared, Mama, when you left everything you knew to go with Papa?" Penelope considered the question. "A little, but I was more scared of staying and losing myself, of becoming someone I wasn't just to please other people." Going with your father was the bravest thing I ever did, but it was also the easiest decision because I knew in my heart it was right." Jacob looked at his father. "And you really didn't care that people thought she was too wild," Harrison laughed. "I thought she was perfect. Still do. Your mother's wildness, her refusal to be put in a box, that's what makes her special, and that's what I want all of you to remember. Don't let anyone tell you who you should be or how you should live. Be brave enough to be yourselves, even when it's hard." The children absorbed this lesson, and Penelope could see it shaping who they became. Jacob grew into a confident young man who respected women as equals, having been raised by a mother who could outwork and outrope most men. Emily and Grace grew up knowing they could choose any path they wanted, whether that was marriage and family or something else entirely. As the children grew older and more independent, Penelope and Harrison found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other. They would ride out together to the far pastures, sometimes spending a night under the stars like they had on the trail to Texas all those years ago. They would lie on their bedrolls, Harrison's arm around Penelope, and marvel at how much life they'd lived together. "Do you ever regret it?" Harrison asked one night when they were both in their 40s, the children nearly grown. "Leaving Kansas, giving up the life you might have had?" Penelope propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight. "Not for a single second. That wasn't a life, Harrison. It was a slow suffocation. This with you, building this ranch and raising our children and being free to be ourselves, this is living. This is what I was born for." "I love you," Harrison said, pulling her down to kiss her. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that churchyard with fire in your eyes, and I'll love you until the day I die and beyond." "You're getting sentimental in your old age," Penelope teased, but her eyes were shining with tears. "Can you blame me? I'm married to the most remarkable woman in Texas." "Just Texas?" Penelope asked with mock offense. "The most remarkable woman in the whole damn world," Harrison amended, and kissed her again. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Jacob married a spirited young woman who reminded everyone of Penelope, and they built a house on the northern edge of the ranch property. Emily surprised everyone by going to teachers' college, and then returning to start a school for the children of the ranch families in the area. Grace married a banker from Amarillo and moved to the city, but visited often with her growing family. Harrison and Penelope became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their legacy spread through the generations. They aged together, their bodies becoming slower and stiffer but their love remaining as strong as ever. Harrison's dark hair turned silver, and Penelope's auburn became streaked with gray. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love beside a campfire on the Kansas prairie. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party at the ranch. The whole community came, generations of people who had been touched by Harrison and Penelope's partnership and the example they'd set. There were speeches and toasts, and more than one person mentioned how Penelope had changed what people thought was possible for women in the Panhandle. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home, Harrison and Penelope slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. They sat in the same chairs they'd been sitting in for decades, holding hands and watching the stars. 40 years, Penelope said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've lived a dozen lifetimes together. All of them good, Harrison said. Even the hard times, we faced them together. Do you remember what you said to me that day at your camp, when you told me I was wild enough for you? I remember every word I've ever said to you, Harrison said. But yes, I remember that especially. You were so afraid that your wildness would always be a problem, that you'd always be too much for people, and I wanted you to know that you were exactly enough for me." Penelope leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved me, you know. Not because I needed rescuing, but because you gave me permission to save myself. You showed me that I didn't have to change to be loved. I could be exactly who I was, and that would be enough." "You saved me too," Harrison said. "I was just drifting through life before you. You gave me purpose and passion, and a reason to build something lasting. Everything good in my life came from loving you." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in the way only people who have spent a lifetime together can be. Finally, Penelope spoke again. "I want you to know that if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Every choice that led me to you, every moment we've shared, I'd choose it all again without hesitation." "So would I," Harrison said, kissing her forehead. "You were called too wild, but you were always wild enough for me. More than enough. You were everything I never knew I needed." They watched the stars wheel overhead, two wild hearts that had found each other against all odds and built a love that would endure for generations. Their story would be told and retold in the Panhandle, becoming legend. But for Harrison and Penelope, it was simply their life, the life they'd chosen together, and it was more than enough. As they grew older still, into their 60s and then 70s, they gradually handed over the ranch operations to Jacob and his family. But they never stopped being partners, never stopped working together on the smaller tasks they could still manage. Harrison tended the horses in the smaller corral near the house, and Penelope kept a vegetable garden that fed the whole extended family. They walked together every evening, slower now but still covering the familiar paths around the ranch headquarters. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the changes they'd seen in the world, about the memories they'd made together. And every night, they fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for another day together. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78 with Penelope beside him. She held his hand and told him she loved him one last time, and though he didn't wake, she felt his fingers squeeze hers gently, a final message of love. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across the Panhandle and beyond. Harrison Wade had been respected as a rancher and businessman, but he was loved as a good man who had treated everyone with dignity and had shown that a marriage could be a true partnership of equals. Person after person told Penelope stories of how Harrison had helped them, advised them, or simply treated them with kindness when others wouldn't. Penelope grieved deeply, but she didn't break. She'd had 48 years with the love of her life, and she carried those years with her like a treasure. She lived for another 12 years, staying active and involved with the ranch and her family. She told stories about Harrison to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who hadn't known him as well. She taught her great-granddaughters to ride and to be fearless, just as she had been. She told them about growing up in Kansas, about the day she fired a gun in the churchyard, about meeting a cowboy who saw her wildness as a gift rather than a flaw. She wanted them to know that they could be anything, do anything, if they were brave enough to be themselves. On her 90th birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of family, Penelope looked around at all the lives that had come from that moment when she chose to be wild, when she chose Harrison, when she chose freedom over convention. There were dozens of people in the room, all of them carrying forward the legacy of courage and authenticity that she and Harrison had built together. That night, she sat on the porch alone for the first time in years, looking up at the stars. She thought about Harrison, about all the nights they'd sat in these same chairs, all the dreams they'd shared and made real. She thought about her father, who had given her his blessing even though it scared him. She thought about her mother, who she understood now in a way she couldn't when she was younger, who had tried to be wild in a world that wouldn't let her. "I did it," she whispered to the night sky, to Harrison, to her parents, to anyone who might be listening. "I lived wild and free, and I loved and was loved in return. That's all any of us can hope for." Penelope Morgan Wade passed away peacefully in her sleep a month later, on a warm Texas night with the windows open and the prairie wind blowing through. Her family said she died with a smile on her face, and they liked to imagine that she'd gone to join Harrison, that they were riding together somewhere beyond the stars, wild and free forever. The ranch remained in the family for generations, and the story of Harrison and Penelope became legend in the Texas Panhandle. People told it as an example of what real love looked like, of what happened when two people chose to see each other clearly and love each other completely. They told it to encourage young people to be brave, to choose authenticity over convention, to never apologize for being exactly who they were meant to be. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy they left. Not the ranch, not the business success, but the example of two wild hearts that found each other and built a love that changed everyone it touched. Penelope had been called too wild, but Harrison had known the truth. She wasn't too wild for anything. She was exactly wild enough for him. And together, they had been exactly wild enough to build a life worth living, a love worth remembering, and a legacy worth continuing. Their story proved that sometimes the things the world calls flaws are actually gifts, that the wildness we're told to suppress might be the very thing that makes us special. It proved that real love doesn't ask us to be smaller or quieter or more acceptable. Real love says you're exactly enough just as you are, and then it runs wild alongside us into whatever adventures life brings. That was the lesson that echoed through the generations, carried forward by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Be wild, be brave, be yourself. And when you find someone who loves you for exactly who you are, hold on to them with everything you have, because that kind of love is rare and precious and worth more than anything else the world has to offer. And so the story of the preacher's daughter who was called too wild and the cowboy who said, "You're wild enough for me," lived on, a testament to the power of love, the importance of authenticity, and the beautiful wildness that lives in all of us, waiting for someone brave enough to set it free.